What's up, y'all? This is John Helm with Helm Shop and Smithy, back with another knife making video. I hadn't been making a lot of videos lately because we moved, I had a new shop to set up, I've just been super busy, but I am back, and it's been a while since I made an instructional video, so I decided to go ahead and do one of those today. And what we're going to be learning today is how to make Damascus steel. Now, what we commonly refer to as Damascus steel today isn't actually Damascus steel, it's pattern welded steel. So before all you internet tough guys hop in the comments and they're like, that's not real Damascus is made in the crucible, we get it. I'm gonna call it Damascus throughout this entire video, and if you don't like it, you can show up and fight me, or you could shut up. So the basic premise behind making Damascus is you're gonna take two dissimilar steels and alternate them in a stack, and then heat them up until they're almost melted and squish them into one piece of steel. That way you have layers of the different types of steel running through the billet. So here I have regular carbon steel, this is 1080, and then here I have 15N20, which is also a relatively simple steel, but it has some nickel in it so it doesn't etch as dark as the simple steel does. And we're going to alternate that in a stack like so. Then we will weld the sides up so they stay together. We'll put it in the heat, we'll get it screaming hot, and then we'll put it in the press and squish the whole thing together. But before we can do that, we have all this mill scale on the outside, and that crud is gonna stop us from having nice clean welds. So the first thing that we're gonna do is take our little bits of steel over to the grinder, grind off all this oxidation so we have nice, clean, freshly ground steel ready to weld. Now these have all been ground nice and clean, and you can see here on the side that these on the sides are marked with a blue marker and these are marked with a black marker. This is so that I don't get my 15N20 and my 1084 mixed up, because you definitely don't want to find yourself in a situation where you don't know which piece of steel is which. But now I'm going to clean them off with acetone, and when I do that, it's going to rinse these off at the sides more than likely, so you need to be very careful to keep them separate from one another from now on. Now that the steel is all clean, it's time to go ahead and get our stacks ready. So we're going to alternate 15N20 and 1084. I'm going to do this until we have 20 layers. Then to get the stack nice and square, I like to use this drill press vise to get them all set. So we'll set it in here, gets those edges nice and even while you're applying the clamping pressure to them. Just like so. And now I'll flip this upside down and transfer it to my bench vise. Now I will remove the drill press vise. Alright, so I got these all welded up. Now, throughout this entire process, it is very, very important that you keep your billets clean as possible. So before I move on, I'm going to hit them with a steel wire brush. Make sure I get all that slag and gunk from welding them off before I move on and get them fluxed and then put them in the forge. So the next big step will be to light the forge, get these things hot and squish them. But before I do that, I need to make sure that I do everything in my power to ensure that they do not get any amount of oxidation in between these layers, because if they do, it will stop them from welding properly. So what I'm going to do first is stick them here in this can of kerosene and let them soak for a bit. Now I'll go ahead and light my forge. Obviously I'm going to store this can of kerosene well away from the forge while it is lit. We don't need super flammable chemicals and fire in the same vicinity. Alright, now that the forge is nice and toasty, we're going to go ahead and take these out and sprinkle just a little bit of flux on the sides. Now I've heard people soaking in kerosene as though it were going to somehow prevent oxidation. I don't know if that's true or not. Really the reason that I do it is because it allows me to stick flux on here before the billet gets hot. So I'm just going to sprinkle some along the sides there, all the way around. And now I'll go ahead and pop this in the forge and I'll heat it up, but not all the way to welding temp. First thing I'm going to do is heat them up until they're just starting to get red hot, and then I'll take them over to the press and smash out any air gaps that are in between these pieces of metal. Make sure that we allow oxygen as little opportunity as possible to get in between there. And that'll stop the oxidation from forming and give us better chances of having a successful weld. Alright, now I got some flux on these. I'm going to take them over to the heat and pop them in. See that billet is starting to get red hot all around the edges. I'm going to go ahead and pull it out and squish it as flat as I can get it in the press. Then we'll reflex it, toss it back in the forge and get it up to welding heat. I'm not going to take this out of the forge until it is basically as hot as my forge can possibly get it. You want to get it as hot as you can without melting it. You can really tell when you start to get close to the temperature because the top of the metal starts to look like sticky. Basically it looks like just the very outside of the metal is beginning to melt. Then you know it's ready to go. But you got to also remember that that billet is very, very thick. So if just the outside is that temperature, that's not good enough. Once it hits that temperature, you want to let it soak. Depending on your forge, this could be as long as 10-15 minutes. And also that depends on the size of the billet. This is a pretty sizable billet, so once it gets up to temp, I'm going to let it sit for about 6-7 minutes before I take it out and stick it in the press for the first welding heat. Now you can see that the billet is the same color as the rest of the inside of the forge is, which is a good indication that at least the outside of the billet is up to temperature. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and start my soak. 6 or 7 minutes from now, I'll pull it out and just barely kissing on those dies on the press to make sure everything gets stuck together without destroying the billet. Brush off all the scale, hit it with a little bit more flux, and toss it right back into the forge for another welding heat. So that first welding heat went particularly well. It looks like we have a completely consolidated piece of steel right now. But just to be careful, I'm going to go ahead and take another welding heat where I don't put a lot of attention into drawing the billet out. Just try to make sure everything is welded as well as it can be. Alright, I let it soak for a few minutes. It's looking nice and hot, so we'll go ahead and take it back to the press. So, now we are back in the forge for the third and final welding heat. On this heat, as soon as I get it into the press, I like to forge on the sides of the billet rather than on the top and the bottom, because if you are hot enough, you can make sure that any cold shuts that you have all along the edges get sealed up nice and tight, and that way you can have a billet with no delaminations in it, with the exception of the very ends. You will almost always have a little bit of sacrificial steel on either side, but that's okay because we're going to have to cut and stack this anyway, and wasting a little bit of steel just comes with the territory of making Damascus. Now you can see if there's a delamination along the side because you'll get a nice dark line in between the layers, and there is not one present anywhere on this billet. We have here a very successfully welded billet of Damascus. You can see right here, there's this little crack in the surface. Now this is probably just a crack in the scale on top of the steel, but I don't know that for sure. So I'm going to grind it down with an angle grinder, make sure that there are no delaminations before I forge it out into a long bar to cut and stack. Because if this is a crack in the steel and I forge this down thin, I'm just going to be forging that crack deeper and deeper down into the billet, and that's obviously no good. Now this isn't a step that everybody takes, and it does take a lot of time, but if you don't do it, you could potentially risk ruining the entire piece of Damascus. So to me, it's worth every second. So I suspected that must have been a problem, and I'm really lucky that I did, because this thing was about 1/4 of an inch deep. If I would have forged this down to 3/8 of an inch, it would have gone almost all the entire way through the billet, and I would have wasted an entire section of the Damascus. And where there's one, there are likely to be others. So I'm going to go ahead and grind off this whole thing, make sure it's super clean, and then we'll forge it down. Alright, so I got all these surfaces ground off, and the cracks weren't as deep as I was afraid they were going to be, which is good. But since I did it on the surface grinding attachment, and it leaves this nice finish, and they're perfectly flat, I'm going to take the chance to go ahead and tack weld these together, forge weld them, and then I'll draw the whole billet out as one piece. Alright, I got this all forged out. I was going to cut this into 4 sections so I didn't have to forge it all the way out. I took it down to about 1/2 inch thick. Now I'm going to clean off the top of this with a grinding wheel on an angle grinder, and then I'll get it nice and flat on the belt grinder before we restack and weld it once again. Now after you cut it, there's a really good opportunity to take a look at the ends here and see how well your welds have stuck. Now you can see there aren't any lines on the inside there. There's one solid chunk of steel, so this is good Damascus here. Now, I got most of the scale taken off with the angle grinder, but as you can see, it's still really bumpy, and we have some pretty deep divots in here. So I'm going to get these cleaned up and flattened off on the belt grinder. And then depending on which one has the deepest divots, I'll decide which order I want to stack them in. If there are some that I'm going to have to remove way too much steel in order to get it clean, I'll be sure to put that one piece on the top so I don't have to waste a bunch of it. to get that billet out of the forge, the handle had actually melted off of it, but the billet was so hot, I just stuck it, and it instantly forge welded, and I was able to pull it out and get it into the press. So I'm pretty confident that that first welding heat went really well. We're going to do 2 more and get it to its final dimensions, which are going to be really for this billet just a little over an inch thick, because I'm going to be making an axe out of this, so I'm not going to draw it out as long and thin as I normally would. Now I've given this a little bit of time to cool. I'm going to take it over to the belt grinder and take off any of this steel, make sure I don't have any inclusions or whatnot in it. I'm a little bit concerned about this top piece here. I'm hoping that this crack here doesn't go in very deep, but I want to make sure that I get it all ground out before I move forward trying to forge this into an axe head. So I'll take it over to the 2x72, spend a little time getting all that off, and then we'll do a test etch and we can see how the pattern looks. Alright, I got it all ground off, and it's nice and clean. Wasn't as bad as I was afraid it was going to be. Those are only about 1/8 of an inch thick on the worst side. So I didn't lose a ton of steel, and I didn't have to go through a ton of belts either. Let's go toss it in the acid and see how it looks. And there you have it, nice clean chunk of Damascus steel. This is a really big piece. I'm gonna say it weighs about 4 pounds. So that should be plenty to make the axe. Actually, this would probably be plenty to make 2 axes. And that is how it's done. Of course, there's more than one way to skin a cat, and I'm no expert at making Damascus. This is just a method that I use, and it's been working well for me. Although, I'm always looking to up my game, so if you have any good tips, techniques, different ways that you like to do it, be sure to put those in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you can see my next video, where I'll be turning this big old chunk of Damascus into a badass axe. And as always, thank y'all for watching. Have a good one.